As you can see from my byline, I am not a lawyer. While I tried to get the legal details accurate, I could not possibly do justice to the head-spinning complexities of 90-plus years of legal wrangling that followed Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's death. My main interest is in how the legalities around Sir Arthur's legacy have affected the lives of his survivors and the literary afterlives of Holmes, Watson, and the other characters that he brought to life so wonderfully in his writing. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle died at his home, Windlesham Manor in Sussex, on July 7, 1930. His last earthly words to his wife were, "You are wonderful." After a simple ceremony that emphasized his spiritualist beliefs, he was laid to rest on the grounds of Windlesham near the garden shed that he had used for his writing. His wife and sons maintained that he continued to communicate with them from the other side. Those of us remaining on this side cannot know for sure, but we do know that Sir Arthur's literary creations were about to embark on a long, strange, and contentious afterlife. Sir Arthur's will was fairly straightforward. His wife, Lady Jean, and his oldest surviving son, Dennis, were named as executors. In addition to bequests to various spiritualist organizations, relatives, and friends, he left his daughter Mary, the only surviving child of his first marriage, £2,000, but no rights over his literary estate. Lady Jean received all the contents of the house at Windlesham, including furnishings, books, letters, pictures, and manuscripts. Upon Lady Jean's death, these artifacts were to be divided among the 4 children, Mary, Lena Jean, Dennis, and Adrian, in whatever way they could agree upon. The rest of the estate was divided between Lady Jean, who received half, and her 3 children, who split the other half. Lady Jean and Dennis, the executors, were directed to, quote, "deal as they think best with copyrights, plays, cinema rights, or unpublished manuscripts," unquote. Any proceeds of the literary estate went to Lady Jean and her 3 children. There were no more detailed instructions than that for the management of Sir Arthur's tremendous literary legacy. While these provisions seem simple enough, they were to lead to friction and complications that Sir Arthur had almost certainly not foreseen. After Sir Arthur's death, Lady Jean was primarily interested in promoting his spiritualist beliefs and achievements, and in safeguarding his reputation as a great writer and a great man. In 1931, she commissioned the Reverend John Lamond to write a biography of Sir Arthur. Lamond wrote from a spiritualist perspective and presented the image of Sir Arthur that Lady Jean approved of. However, the book was not a great success either commercially or artistically. Lady Jean was also invested in the idea that Sir Arthur himself was the primary model for Sherlock Holmes, since he had actually solved several real-life cases that the police had fumbled. However, she does not appear to have wanted to cash in on Sherlock Holmes by charging exorbitant rates for rights to the use of the character. Instead, she simply referred license requests to A.P. Watt, her husband's longtime literary agency, and let them deal with the matter. While Lady Jean seems to have been content with her financial share of the estate, unfortunately the same could not be said of Adrian and Dennis. Their only source of income was their father's estate, and they were determined to make the most of it. But their approach wasn't always the best for either their own profit or the continued good reputation of the family. Their attempts to squeeze as much money as possible out of every deal tended to backfire more often than it benefited them. For example, in 1938, in the wake of the highly successful 20th Century Fox production of The Hound of the Baskervilles, film agent Paul Kohner made a deal with MGM in Hollywood to buy the rights to all the rest of the Holmes stories. MGM was willing to pay $15,000 per short story and $25,000 per novel. The estate's London representative, Rudolph Jess, had okayed the deal, and all that was still needed was a Conan Doyle signature on the contract. However, by December 1938, Lady Jean was seriously ill and in hospital and could not be bothered with estate business. Dennis, the other executor, wanted to hold out for more money. Between this demand and a series of complications around 20th Century Fox's film rights to the Holmes character, MGM backed off and the lucrative opportunity was lost. A similar thing happened in the book publishing business. In the U.S., the Doubleday Publishing Company had a tradition of publishing the Holmes stories in various editions of varying quality. In 1936, Doubleday came out with their single-volume omnibus edition of the complete Holmes canon, featuring the classic Christopher Morley introduction. 2 years later, they issued the Garden City Deluxe edition at a reduced price, identical except for the title page. The Garden City edition stayed in print for 20 years through the Great Depression and World War II. However, in 1946, the brothers, badly in need of extra funds as usual, decided to try to revise their royalty agreement and threatened to withdraw permission for the 12 casebook stories that were still under their control. Doubleday refused to knuckle under to the outrageous demand for a 25% royalty, and publication was suspended for the next 3 years, neatly cutting off what would surely have been a sales bonanza in the roaring post-war economic boom. This pattern of unreasonable demands followed by lost revenue was repeated over and over. In the meantime, and even sadder on a personal level, family friction was mounting steadily. In a way, Sir Arthur may have contributed to the problem by naming Dennis but not Adrian as an executor. While both brothers were drawn to an extravagant lifestyle, Adrian seems to be the one who got stuck with much of the day-to-day administrative work, while Dennis was more likely to be off on expensive globe-trotting adventures. Since Adrian had less legal authority and more responsibility, conflict and resentment were inevitable. Whenever Adrian needed Dennis to do some legal executor thing, it seemed like Dennis was off in Africa or India, hunting big game or schmoozing with maharajas. And in 1951 and 52, it came to Adrian's attention that the family business was in deep trouble due to Dennis's betrayal of his trust. Starting in fall of 1951, Adrian had been seeing strange messages about missing money and suspicious gossip around Dennis and his wife Nina. Finally, Dennis had to confess that for several years he had been cashing royalty checks payable to him as executor and simply keeping it all rather than paying Adrian and his sister Jean their share. All the money had gone to fund his and Nina's flamboyant lifestyle. Not only was he out of money, he was deeply in debt, including for U.S. taxes. Adrian was furious not only at Dennis, but also at Nina, whom he largely blamed for the pair's profligacy. The rupture between the two brothers was as serious as the financial hole they were in, but Adrian had a plan to at least recoup the money. John Dixon Carr was a hugely popular American crime writer who had already collaborated with Adrian on a biography of Sir Arthur. The two had stayed in touch, and they had decided to co-write a series of pastiches based on cases that Watson had mentioned in passing in the canon. Dennis and Jean were both against the project, feeling that it diluted their father's work, but Adrian plowed ahead, believing that the new stories were actually an extension of his father's authorship and honored his spirit. Even though Dennis as executor did not sign off on the project, Adrian still included a note in the first story's publication in Life magazine that the story was approved by the estate. While the projected series brought in good revenue from Life and Collier's magazines, the writing did not go smoothly. Carr, under pressure from other projects and from his own poor health, did not hold up his end of the bargain, and Adrian wrote the last 6 stories on his own. The collection was published in book form in 1954 as The Exploits of Sherlock Holmes. The Baker Street Journal panned it, claiming that it should have been titled Sherlock Holmes Exploited. But at least it served its purpose of easing the financial strain on the family. In the meantime, Dennis and Adrian had managed to get back on good terms. This was fortunate, because on March 9, 1955, Dennis died in India of heart failure. He was only 43. In the late 1950s and through the 60s, the estate prospered, whether because of or in spite of Adrian's management. The movie industry was booming, and in 1962, Adrian and his agent Henry Lester started a new production company, Sir Nigel Films. Even with the usual legal complications that seemed to follow all Conan Doyle activities, the company managed to produce 3 films. The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes and A Study in Terror featured the ever-popular Holmes, while The Adventures of Gerard was based on the somewhat lesser-known Brigadier Gerard short stories. You can see a very 1960s vibe in these posters. Getting these films off the ground was challenging. Dennis's widow, Nina, had inherited Dennis's share of the estate, and she continued to involve herself in the estate's activities. Due largely to her complaints against Adrian, the heirs employed the Swiss company Fides Union Fiduciaire to act as a trustee alongside Adrian. Nina also demanded that no new contracts be signed with Sir Nigel Films. Somehow the court agreed to her demands, leaving Sir Nigel with only the films that had already been contracted. And then Adrian died suddenly on June 3, 1970, just a few months before the premiere of The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. After Adrian's death, his sister Jean and the two widows, Anna and Nina, agreed to sell the estate, including copyrights, film, TV, and radio contracts, and 56 boxes of Sir Arthur's original documents. However, the trust company, Fides Union Fiduciaire, wanted to keep exploiting the rights. After yet another round of complicated legal maneuvering, the sale of the estate went through for a price of over £17,000. Jean and Anna did not find out the buyer's identity until the transaction was final. It was Nina. They were not pleased. Nina immediately established a new company, Baskervilles Investments Limited. She set about monetizing everything that could be monetized, with new contracts with publishers, film, TV, and theater producers, and food and beverage firms. She even tried to register the name Sherlock Holmes as a trademark. To her credit, the estate's income rose to more than it had been under Adrian. The downside was that she had bought the estate with a very large loan from the Royal Bank of Scotland and had also taken out a personal loan. Her intention was to use the estate income to continue her lavish lifestyle, but the bank was keeping a close eye on her finances, and it didn't like what it saw. Nina and her new husband, Tony Harwood, in addition to their huge personal expenses, seemed determined to continue the Dennis and Adrian approach of turning down good offers in hopes of better ones that never materialized. As the loan interest mounted and the repayments dwindled, the bank finally put Baskervilles Investments into receivership. The company's finances continued to deteriorate, and Nina and Tony were forced to sell some of their prized possessions just to keep making payments. And then in January 1976, Tony Harwood died. Nina's situation had become hopeless. She would never repay the loan. Enter Sheldon Reynolds, a TV producer who had made 39 episodes about Sherlock Holmes in the U.S. way back in 1954. Now, 22 years later, he was ready to buy the entire estate and get what he could from it before the British copyrights expired in 1980. With financial backing from his in-laws, he and his wife Andrea took over all rights from Baskervilles Investments in August of 1976. The hound had again met its end. Up to this point, Lena Annette Jean, Sir Arthur's younger daughter, had largely taken a back seat to her brothers and their wives. She had created a life for herself outside of her father's literary legacy. In 1938, in the lead-up to World War II, she joined the Women's Royal Air Force and served as an intelligence officer. She made a career of the Women's Air Force, rising through the ranks to become its director in 1963, the same year she was made a dame. She retired in 1966, but remained active in military clubs and service organizations. Then Adrian's death and the ill-fated Baskervilles Investments fiasco combined with an impending change in U.S. copyright law to finally bring her into hands-on management of her father's estate. The new U.S. copyright law not only increased the length of time a work could remain under copyright, it also made it possible for direct descendants of the author to reclaim the copyrights. Dame Jean was the only person who qualified as a descendant, and after much consideration, she decided she owed it to her father to take over the rights and exercise the kind of quality control that she felt her brothers had neglected. She recruited a support group of BSI members who shared her values, went through the legal process, and in November of 1981, she became the owner of Sir Arthur's remaining U.S. copyrights. Any work based on these still protected materials that might ever be available in the U.S. was now subject to her approval. She set to work ensuring that her father's spirit would be honored in any new Holmes projects. For example, in 1984, Paramount Pictures and Steven Spielberg were proposing a new movie called Young Sherlock Holmes. They needed Jean's approval, but she was horrified by the first draft of the script. It was full of violence and gore, inappropriate for the young audience at whom it was directed. Paramount executive Michael Eisner had no choice but to meet with Jean and make the desired changes, bringing the movie more into line with what she believed her father would have approved of. While she was protective of Sir Arthur's vision, she was also happy to move with the times. In 1988, the TV show Star Trek: The Next Generation wanted to produce an episode featuring Commander Data and other crew members having a Holmes Moriarty adventure in the holodeck. For any non-Trekkies, Commander Data is an android who is constantly trying to become more human, and the holodeck is a sort of virtual reality environment on the Enterprise where crew members can interact with computer-generated characters in fictional situations. Jean liked the idea, and the episode helped introduce Sherlock Holmes to a new generation of sci-fi loving young Americans. While Jean liked Holmes, he was not her favorite character. She preferred Professor Challenger, and she often felt that Holmes took up too much of her time. She could sympathize with her father wanting to push him over the Reichenbach Falls. Even if she didn't see herself as a dedicated Sherlockian, Dame Jean was so important to Sir Arthur's legacy that the Sherlockian world embraced her as one of their own. Although the BSI had been a men-only club ever since its first dinner, by the 1990s that restriction was simply no longer defensible. At the January 1991 dinner, Dame Jean was invested as a BSI member to thunderous applause. Then several other women who should have been invested long before were added to the ranks. It was the long overdue beginning of a new era. But before the 90s were over, another era would end. After several years of failing health, Jean died in November of 1997, and the last direct descendant of Sir Arthur was gone. Dame Jean, who had suffered from poor eyesight throughout her life, bequeathed the U.S. copyrights to the Royal National Institute for the Blind. However, when the Institute realized that the bequest would require a good deal of ongoing management, it sold the rights to Dame Jean's residual beneficiaries. Her cousin Charles Foley, a great-nephew of Sir Arthur, was her executor, and now he and several other relatives owned the U.S. copyrights. And to add to the confusion, there were still more changes in British and American copyright laws. A 1998 change in U.S. law brought the copyright period to 95 years after the first U.S. publication date. This kept the last few Sherlock Holmes stories under copyright, with the last one expiring on January 1, 2023. To take advantage of these extra years, Dame Jean's residual beneficiaries formed a company, Conan Doyle Estate Limited. Their website states that their work, quote, continues to this day in promoting, protecting, and developing the legacy of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, unquote. And to some extent, at least, that seems to be true. For example, in 2007, the estate authorized the publication of a selection of Conan Doyle's letters. The book, Arthur Conan Doyle, A Life in Letters, won numerous awards, including an Edgar for Best Critical Biographical Work. But sadly, as the clock ticked onward towards the end of the copyright protections, the estate seemed to be more interested in cashing in on Sir Arthur's legacy than in safeguarding it. They developed a habit of demanding license fees for any use of any Conan Doyle characters, particularly Holmes and Company, without much concern as to whether the character truly remained under copyright or was already in the public domain. And many authors, producers, publishers, etc. found it easier to simply pay a license fee rather than spend even more money and delay production by fighting an expensive, time-consuming court case. This approach usually worked, but then the estate bit off more than it could chew. Sherlockians Les Klinger and Laurie King co-edited an anthology of original Sherlock Holmes pastiches titled A Study in Sherlock, which was published in 2011 by Random House. Before the anthology was published, the Conan Doyle estate asserted to Random House that the estate had exclusive rights to use the characters of Holmes and Watson, and if Random House intended to publish the anthology, it needed to enter into a licensing agreement with the estate. Random House caved and signed and paid. Klinger and King then co-edited a second anthology titled In the Company of Sherlock Holmes, to be published by Pegasus Books. When the estate learned of the book's impending publication, it demanded a license fee and threatened to prevent Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and similar retailers from carrying the book if Pegasus refused. Pegasus Books was worried enough that they did not finalize the contract to publish the book. This was too much for Klinger, who believed that the characters of Holmes and Watson had already entered the public domain and hence could be freely used. He filed a copyright lawsuit against the estate in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, seeking a determination that he could legally publish in the company of Sherlock Holmes without paying the estate for a license. Of course, there was a lot of legal back and forth, but Klinger won the first round. The estate appealed, and on May 22, 2014, Sir Arthur's 155th birthday, the case was heard at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. The estate's argument essentially went that aspects of Holmes and Watson's personality that were developed in the later, still copyrighted stories could not be used without license. So things like Holmes being more emotional, less cold, caring about Watson, or respecting women were off limits. And since personality traits could not be separated out from the complete personality, it would be almost impossible to create a public domain Holmes that would escape copyright. Presiding Judge Richard Posner's response could be summarized as, "Oh, come on." The estate lost the appeal. Klinger then filed a petition asking the court to require the estate to pay about $30,000 in legal fees. The estate asked for a stay and tried to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, which was supremely uninterested in the matter. Judge Posner awarded Klinger the nearly $31,000 and gave the estate a good scolding. Quote, "The Doyle estate's business strategy is plain. Charge a modest license fee for which there is no legal basis in the hope that the rational writer or publisher asked for the fee will pay it rather than incur a greater cost in legal expenses in challenging the legality of the demand. The strategy had worked with Random House. Pegasus was ready to knuckle under. Only Klinger, so far as we know, resisted. In effect, he was a private attorney general combating a disreputable business practice, a form of extortion, and he is seeking by the present motion not to obtain a reward, but merely to avoid a loss." Unquote. And finally, he recommended, "It's time the estate, in its own self-interest, changed its business model." Ouch! You'd think that after such a resounding defeat at the hands of Les Klinger and such a scolding from Judge Posner, the estate would have learned its lesson. But apparently they were willing to keep their business model in play. In May of 2015, the estate sued Miramax Pictures over the movie Mr. Holmes, based on the novel A Slight Trick of the Mind by Mitch Cullen. The book and movie portray an older, retired Holmes keeping bees in Sussex and trying to remember the details of his last case. Even though the concept of Holmes retiring and keeping bees in Sussex was introduced in The Adventure of the Second Stain in 1904, the estate thought it was worth a try to claim copyright protection. At any rate, the estate and the defendants settled out of court in September, and the movie was allowed to proceed. Perhaps emboldened by the settlement with Miramax and Cullen, the estate took on another hard target in 2020. The movie Enola Holmes, based on a series of novels by Nancy Springer, portrays Sherlock's younger sister solving mysteries and taking on villains, which she is determined to do with or without Sherlock's and Mycroft's help. The main thrust of the estate's argument in this case was that in the Enola books and movie, Holmes is portrayed as having emotions, including more respect for women in general, and specifically affection and concern for his sister. As before, they claimed that these qualities do not show up until the last 10 canonical stories that were still under copyright. The idea that the Holmes of the early stories was completely devoid of emotion seems like a stretch, especially in the specific case of his attitude toward a sister. In The Adventure of the Copper Beeches, published in 1892, Holmes is called on to advise Violet Hunter on a very suspicious offer of employment as a governess. He tells Violet, "I confess that it is not the situation which I should like to see a sister of mine apply for." As the case develops, he repeatedly tells Watson that no sister of his should ever have accepted such a situation. If he could show such concern for a hypothetical sister, surely he would have been even more devoted to a real flesh and blood one. Nevertheless, like the Miramax case before it, the Enola Holmes case was settled out of court. Presumably that business model was still working out okay. Fortunately, it won't continue to work for much longer. The U.S. copyright for the last of the Sherlock Holmes stories expires on January 1st, 2023. Other Conan Doyle stories were published through 1930, with their copyrights expiring by 2025. But with the expiration of the last Sherlock Holmes copyright, the bulk of the most significant stories and characters will enter the public domain. Holmes and Watson, Moriarty and Moran, Professor Challenger, Sir Nigel, Brigadier Gerard, and the rest will belong to all of us, as in truth they always have. Now it's up to us to be good stewards of Sir Arthur's legacy in the future. I've barely scratched the surface of the last 90 years of legal and familial craziness. Here's a short list of sources for more information about the adventure of the Conan Doyle estate.